My wife and I had just moved into our new house 2 months ago, and for the most part everything went smoothly. The neighborhood was quaint, with tree-lined streets and houses that whispered tales of the past through their aged facades. Our immediate neighbor, Mr. Hargrove, was an elderly man, always seen tending to his impeccable garden or sitting on his front porch, his eyes hidden behind thick tinted glasses. At first, Mr. Hargrove seemed like the epitome of the friendly neighbor. He brought over a pie when we moved in, welcomed us with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, and spoke little. My wife and I attributed that last aspect to his age, or perhaps a natural reserve. But eventually, things began to feel off. One evening, as I was taking out the trash, I noticed him standing at the edge of his property, staring directly at our house. Not moving, not speaking, just staring with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. When he noticed me, he waved, his smile returning as if nothing was amiss. But the incidents only grew stranger. Late at night, I'd hear soft footsteps outside our bedroom window. Peering out, I'd catch the fleeting shadow of someone moving away. And more than once, I was certain it was Mr. Hargrove. My wife laughed it off, suggesting it was probably just local wildlife or my imagination. Then came the night that changed everything. It was past midnight when a soft, repetitive tapping woke me. It sounded like it was coming from inside the walls. Annoyed, I got up to investigate, expecting to find a loose pipe or a branch against the house. The tapping led me to the basement door. With each step down, the sound grew louder and more insistent. The basement was cold, and the air was thick with a musty smell. The tapping was now clearly coming from an old, sealed-off section of the wall, hidden behind some shelves I hadn't yet cleared out. Curiosity overwhelmed my unease, and I moved the shelves. With a flashlight in hand, I examined the wall. There was no obvious reason for the noise, including no pipes and nothing else. Then, my light caught something, a small, almost imperceptible crack. I pressed my ear against the cold wall, and the tapping stopped. It was replaced by a whisper, so faint I thought I imagined it. "Help me." The next day, driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, I did some digging into the history of our home. What I found chilled me to the bone. Years ago, Mr. Hargrove's wife had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Rumors swirled, but nothing was proven, and the case went cold. That night, I couldn't sleep. The tapping started again, more desperate this time. I decided to confront Mr. Hargrove the next morning, but when dawn broke, I found police cars outside his house. Mr. Hargrove had passed away in his sleep, they said, natural causes. But here's where it gets truly terrifying. After his death, workers came to clear out his house. In his basement, they found a hidden room, and inside, the remains of his wife. And his wife was assumed to have run away or been kidnapped. She had actually been there all along, right next to us, behind a wall. The tapping never returned, but sometimes, in the dead of night, I swear I hear whispers from the walls. It's as if she's still trying to communicate, to tell her story. And every time I look at Mr. Hargrove's now empty house, I can't shake the feeling that some secrets are better left buried. And some neighbors are better left unknown. Fresh out of college, I began working an entry-level office job in a city far from my home. The pay was just enough to afford a small, somewhat dilapidated apartment in an old building. It was a place where the walls whispered secrets through the vents, and the neighbors were as enigmatic as the creaky floors. My neighbor across the hall was Mr. Harrow. He was an elderly man with a stoop that made him look perpetually curious about the ground. His eyes were sharp, however, always glinting with an unreadable emotion. From the day I moved in, Mr. Harrow took an unusual interest in me. At first, it was just stuff like "good morning" or "how was your day?" But soon, he started asking more personal questions. "Do you miss your family? Do you ever feel lonely here?" His tone was always friendly, but there was something off, something lurking beneath his wrinkled smile. One evening, returning from work, I found a note under my door. It was from Mr. Harrow, inviting me for tea. Feeling that it would be rude to decline, and partly out of curiosity, I accepted. His apartment was like stepping into another era. The air was thick with the smell of old books and something sweeter, almost cloying. We sat, and he poured tea from an antique pot. The conversation started innocuously, but then it took a darker turn. "You know, people in this building disappear sometimes," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They move in, young like you, full of life, and then one day they're just gone." I laughed nervously, thinking it was a strange joke, but his face remained serious. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every noise in the building sounded like footsteps, and every shadow seemed to move. Days passed, and I noticed something chilling. I hadn't seen any other neighbors since that tea. The building, once bustling in its own quiet way, now felt eerily empty. Curiosity got the better of me, and late one night I decided to investigate. The hallways were dimly lit, and as I approached Mr. Harrow's door, I heard soft chanting. The door was ajar, revealing a sliver of candlelight. Peering in, what I saw froze my blood. Mr. Harrow was in the center of a circle drawn on the floor, surrounded by old photographs, some of which I recognized as the faces from missing posters I had seen around town. He was muttering in a language I couldn't understand, his hands weaving through the air as if stitching the very shadows together. I must have made a sound because suddenly his head snapped towards the door, his eyes locked onto mine. There was no pretense of kindness now, only a predatory gleam. I ran back to my apartment, my heart pounding. Locking the door, I realized I had to leave, but when I tried to call for help, my phone had no signal. I remember thinking that was impossible. I always had service here. The next morning, I planned to leave under the guise of needing to run errands, but as I opened my door, there stood Mr. Harrow, smiling as if nothing had happened. "Going somewhere?" he asked, his voice dripping with an unspoken threat. From that day, I've been living in a silent scream. No one comes looking for me. It's as if I've been erased from the world outside. Each night, I hear the chanting, and each day, Mr. Harrow's eyes remind me that I might be next in his collection of lost souls. Here, in this building, I'm not just a neighbor, I'm a prisoner to whatever dark ritual keeps Mr. Harrow eternally curious about the ground. Perhaps he's looking for where he buries his secrets, or his neighbors. For a few months in college, I had a roommate who was, shall we say, not a normal person. His name was Elias, and at first he seemed just a bit eccentric. He had a peculiar habit of speaking to himself in whispers, especially at night, which I initially chalked up to stress or maybe a quirky study habit. As the weeks passed, however, Elias's behavior grew increasingly unsettling. He would often stare blankly at the wall for hours, unresponsive, as if in a trance. One night, I woke up to find him standing over my bed, just watching me sleep. When I jolted upright, he simply smiled and said, "You look peaceful when you're asleep." Then he returned to his bed without another word. The real terror began when I noticed things in our room started to move on their own. Books would fall off shelves, my desk chair would swivel when no one was near it, and cold spots appeared randomly around our small dorm room. Elias would laugh at these occurrences, a laugh that didn't reach his eyes, which always seemed too dark and almost black. Then came the night of the storm. The power went out, and the room was lit only by the occasional flash of lightning. In one such flash, I saw Elias at the window, but he wasn't alone. There was a figure outside, standing in the pouring rain, looking up at our window. Elias waved at it, and to my horror, the figure waved back, its movements jerky and unnatural. Curiosity and fear battled with me until I decided to confront Elias. "Who's that outside?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Oh, that's just my old neighbor," Elias replied with a chilling calmness. "He follows me sometimes. Wants to be friends, you see." The next day, driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, I did some digging. I found out that Elias had lived next to a cemetery back in his hometown. There were rumors, old local legends, about a boy who could speak to the dead, and who would often be seen playing with imaginary friends in the graveyard at dusk. The climax of my horror came when I returned to our room one evening to find Elias wasn't there, but the room still felt occupied somehow. The air was thick, heavy with a presence. Then from the corner of my eye, I saw him, the neighbor, or what was left of him, decayed and spectral. He was just sitting on Elias's bed, his form flickering like a bad TV signal. I screamed, and in that instant, Elias appeared at the door, his expression one of annoyance rather than surprise. "He just wants to be friends," Elias repeated, as if explaining a simple fact to a child. But his eyes, they were entirely black now, no white to be seen. I moved out the next day, no explanation given, none needed. I heard later that Elias left the college under mysterious circumstances, but sometimes, even now in the dead of night, I feel a cold spot beside my bed. I wonder if Elias's neighbor has found a new person to befriend, or worse, if Elias himself is still out there, bridging the world of the living and the dead. For a few years, this family with 2 small kids lived next to us. The Millers, they were called. They were nice folks, at least on the surface. Mr. Miller was always out early, mowing the lawn or fixing something around the house, always with a smile that seemed a bit too wide and a bit too fixed. Mrs. Miller baked cookies and would bring them over, her eyes darting around her living room like she was memorizing every detail. At first, everything seemed normal, the epitome of suburban bliss. But then things started to feel off. It began with small things. I'd found my garden tools in different places than where I'd left them, and then one evening I noticed the light in my attic was on. I hadn't been up there in weeks. Climbing up, I found nothing out of place, but there was this lingering scent, like someone's cologne or perfume I didn't recognize. The real chilling moment came one night when I was up late, unable to sleep. I was in the kitchen getting some water when I glanced out the window towards the Miller's house. There, in the dim light of their backyard, I saw Mr. Miller. He wasn't alone. He was with someone, or rather, something that looked like a person but moved wrong. It was hunched, and its movements were jerky, like a marionette on strings. They were digging, and from where I stood, frozen, it looked like they were burying something, or someone. The next day, I tried to convince myself it was a dream, but the dirt under my fingernails from where I gripped the windowsill told me otherwise. Curiosity mixed with a creeping dread, and it led me to casually inquire about any visitors they might have had. Mrs. Miller, with her ever-present smile, said they had no guests, just us and the kids, keeping to ourselves, you know how it is. Weeks passed, and the incidents grew stranger. I'd hear whispers at night, coming from the direction of their house, but when I looked there was never anyone there. The kids, who used to play loudly in their yard, became quieter, their games less innocent, more like they were mimicking some dark, secretive ritual. One day I decided to investigate, my heart pounding with each step as I approached their property. I found a spot in the garden, freshly turned over. My hands shook as I dug, only to find nothing. But the relief was short-lived when I turned around to see Mr. Miller standing there, his smile gone, and his eyes cold and calculating. "Looking for something?" he asked, his voice devoid of the warmth I once knew. I mumbled something about losing a tool, my excuse sounding weak even to my ears. He nodded, but his gaze held mine with an unspoken warning. After that, I kept my distance, but the feeling of being watched never left. Then, as suddenly as they had arrived, the Millers moved out. There was no for sale sign, no moving trucks during the day. We just woke up and they were gone one morning. I never told anyone, not even my spouse, about what I saw or felt. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear those whispers and I wonder what lies beneath the Miller's old garden. I also wonder what would have happened if I had dug just a little deeper, or if Mr. Miller had decided I knew too much. Now, whenever new neighbors move in, I watch and wait, and I wonder if the cycle will begin anew.